Welcome to Becoming Parents Podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Campbell. I'm a doula in Washoe County, Nevada, a Medicaid provider, a lactation educator, childbirth educator, and mom of 18. You can find me and connect on doulainreno.com. Remember, give a shout out to those who are brave enough to share their stories with us on how they have become parents. Let's dive in. We've been pre-gaming our talk and realized that we should probably just be recording it. So we're just going to kind of jump in. We're both doulas. Suzzie, tell me where you are and what you do. Just tell me about yourself a little. Give us an overview.
Yeah, I'm a doula. I'm in Seattle. I work with all moms. Time I'm in the hospital. I've gotten to work with everybody from very low risk moms to very high risk moms. Everything in between, every type of birth plan imaginable, from I want my baby before Christmas, get me whatever induction you can, to like, I do not accept medical treatment, so protect every right I have. And they're all valid.
Right. And I do too. And it's so interesting. You can share the exact same information, like as far as doulas educating clients, same information. And a third of them can be like, I absolutely want an epidural. And a third of them are
Mhm.
like, I absolutely do not want one. And then there's that middle third that's like, I want to do as many things as I can until we get to that. Like, and let's schedule a C-section. Like we do all of it.
Yeah, I had a mom do that this year actually, which was like the first time I've had that where we were talking about an induction. Her doctor was pushing it really hard, and she was like, I just do not feel comfortable with an induction. I want to move to a C-section. And that's what she ultimately did. And it was a very lovely birth. And it was great because we could actually prepare her for the postpartum and the recovery and be like ready for that moment.
Which is great. And like I personally, the world according to me, prefer to not do inductions almost ever. And when you do them, I feel like some women need to know that they've tried everything possible. And also, I feel like all the hormone release during labor, even in an induction, like there's so many other things going on in your body that are good that even if it ends up 46 hours in or 45 hours in, you end up in a C-section. Like it wasn't a waste to do that. And sometimes scheduling it is just better for mental health too. Like there's so many different
Yeah.
variables in this, right?
Yeah.
Because I think I would try everything possible to get that vaginal delivery before knowing that when I went into a C-section, I've done everything possible. And other women are like, can't do that.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I had a VBAC with my second, and it was so empowering to go after that vaginal birth. And even at the time, I knew like, well, there is a possibility things can go because I had been in labor 24 hours and not even been 3 centimeters dilated with my first. I know. So I was like going into my VBAC very hopeful, but realistic of like, who knows what's going to happen. And it was such an empowering experience to prep for it, to do it. And then it was great that I got the result I wanted. But I know
Mhm.
that even if I hadn't, I would have been glad that I had done all the work, because I truly think that even though C-sections have their time and place, that vaginal birth is just, it's meaningful, and it's also safer, especially like the less we can interfere with it, the
Yeah.
better.
Agreed. I think, there's another doula here in town who had a C-section, her first one. She's already been a doula and this time wanted a VBAC and got it, but it's not, birth is unpredictable. And I think you tell people that and they're still
Mhm.
surprised, but we never know but it's unpredictable, right? And she ended up with the vaginal birth that she wanted, but it took 2 days. She hemorrhaged, she had blood transfusions, she had stitches. It was like it can be the VBAC beautiful birth that you want, and but it's not always the straight point A to B. And still, even with all the things that went sideways in her delivery, she's like, ultimately I got what I wanted and I know I can do it. And that's what I needed. I needed that. So all the other things
Mhm.
aside, it was still worth going through what could be a fairly traumatic process in birth. But I think a lot of that is mindset. Like, you know, no, wherever
Yeah.
your mind is, that's the empowering part of it. We were talking about working with hospitals, and I think one of the Well, let's bring up the top three reasons that doulas have burnout. One, the first two even, not getting paid enough.
Mhm.
And that's one. And then the other thing is not being recognized as part of the care team, despite the fact that we have two government entities, Medicaid and TRICARE, who see us as the care team and want us there and advocate for us to
And
be in these births.
we bill
We bill them.
as care providers, yes.
Yes. We're just non-medical as opposed to medical. And actually, there are several non-medical care provider like types. We're type 90 doula, but there are many, like there's lactation consultants, there's peer support, there's CHWs. I'm sure many others. You don't have to be a medical provider to be part of the care team. But I think that's the one, like my self-pay clients pay me, and we fought in Nevada for medical reimbursement, for Medicaid reimbursement, and we won that. So the legislation in the state of Nevada pays me the same for a Medicaid birth that it does for a
What's your
self-pay.
reimbursement rate through Medicaid?
It's $100 for each visit, so prenatal and
Okay.
postpartum, and we can do 4 without any issue, so that would be $400. We can add them on with, we have to attach a form to it to get more. So 4 of those, and then $900 for a birth, which is a great breakdown. So that's
That's not
13.
very much though. If you're at a birth for 40 hours
It's not. But
and do
it
yeah,
it's a good way to break it down though, because my self-pay clients are 1,500, but if they pay all up front, I give a 10% discount. So it's 1,350. So for us in Nevada, like once you start talking about $1,200, we can have a conversation, right? That's worth it. I'm getting paid enough to make it worth it. And Medicaid pays us 13 to 1,500.
they just we're working on our Medicaid program here in Seattle, but our reimbursement rate is going to be 3,500 a birth. Totally different.
How is yours broken down?
They haven't figured that out yet. They're building the program, but they put the reimbursement rate in the legislation as they did that part. So we are like
Wow.
hopefully in the next couple of years. And I think that will be really great because it seems I remember before when I was doing my training in the first year of being a doula, I was like, well, I would love to be at a birth every day and I would love to take on this many clients. And then you start doing it and you're like, wait, you actually cannot because one birth could be 5 hours, but it's like on average, I'm with a first time family 20 to 25 hours for a first birth,
Right.
right? And they can stack up right next to each other. There's a lot of times where you go from one to another and you
Right.
don't have any I mean, obviously we have backups. Like I have backups if two births happen at the same time. But because you've invested so much effort in that relationship and building that trust and getting that education there for a
Yeah.
mom, it's a big deal to send a backup because you're removing an element of safety and familiarity and trust, which is what you've built together. So
Right.
I feel like it's really important for the doula that did the prep to be the person at the birth, which means you can only do so many each month.
Right. How many do you do a month? How many do you schedule a month?
Okay, so it has changed a little bit because I've added a lot of postpartum hours.
Mm.
I feel like I can go up to 4 or 5
Yeah.
before I feel like I burn out. But in the past few months, I changed my postpartum hours. So the minimum I do is 8, but I'll go up to 40. So if I'm doing 40 hours plus a birth,
Ooh, wow.
I'm not doing as many births a month.
Right. I think if we had I'd love to see your breakdown on that separately, but I think if we had first of all, I like that Medicaid breaks it down into visits and into birth, because if you and I were working together as a backup, and I don't like to use backup either at all, like ever, if I can. But if we were doing that and I was your backup and you did all these prenatal appointments and then I jumped in because you needed help with the birth, I could just bill for the birth and you would do all the prenatal and postpartum. So
Mhm.
I love the ability to be able to split that up without worrying about paying somebody, or like I just bill that part instead of you. So that
Right.
part I love. So that, and I like that breakdown. That works really well. It also gave us an idea on how to set our own self-pay. So if I added on a bunch of postpartum visits, I would just add them on at a flat rate fee per visit, right? That
Mhm.
usually lasts 60 to 90 minutes. Um, Also with TRICARE, the total is only about 900 for visits. They pay like $47 for a prenatal and 500-ish in something. So I take very limited TRICARE clients. And when they reached out to me and said, "We want you to do more clients," I was like, "I'd love to as soon as you raise the reimbursement." Like
Right.
this is what Medicaid does, and this is what you do. And like I can get $400 to $600 more doing the exact same thing. Why am I ever going to want to take a TRICARE client if I can do a Medicaid client and I automatically get paid $600 more? Like that doesn't make sense. You
Mhm.
can have the heart for it and want to do it and not have it be worth it also,
Right.
you
Right,
know?
because at the end of the day, it is a job, and
Yes.
you have a family and bills. I have a family and bills, and I
Right.
have to pay for childcare. I remember when I started, I mostly did backup work. It was like during COVID, was very soon after I started, and I remember there were times where I would get, depending on who I was doing backup. It changed, but because I was a brand new doula, I was, like, charging minimum rates for backup because I was really, like, passionate and wanted to get out there and get my career started, and so there were times where I'd be paid $35 to $50 an hour as this new doula, and I'd turn around and pay my babysitters. I live in Seattle. Everything here is, like, bloated and expensive, so I'd turn around and pay my babysitters $25 to $35 an hour. Like,
Right.
great. I ended up netting $10 an hour. Like, I would have been better off getting a minimum wage job at
Mhm.
Starbucks.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That
Obviously, things have shifted and evolved and grown, and I have had to, like, change my rates, but it is for with the doulas being so emphasized as part of the solution to the maternity crisis we're having here, it is important that as a career, as a profession, it's recognized the same way every other career and profession is, with a paycheck.
And I mean, I don't have any hesitation talking about money. I think it's really important to talk about. Um, Doulas, we're doing so much work, so much education, so much. We don't have shifts at births. My
Mm-mm.
longest birth that I didn't leave was 46 and a half hours. I set up inductions a little differently, so I'm not there the whole time because we don't need to all sit there and stare at this woman waiting for her to go into labor or waiting for the next thing to work. So I set that, and inductions I set up differently, and C-sections, you're at the hospital for like 4 hours, that's really short.
Mhm.
So, I mean, there has to be a balance in that. And part of that is that if I'm going to be gone from my family for all of these hours, and during those hours, that person is more important than my family because I'm choosing to spend time with it, I better be getting a paycheck for it. Like
Right.
right. And,
And we will
uh,
miss things like Christmas. I've missed
oh,
my
yeah.
kids' birthdays. I've come back. My daughter is a gymnast, and we had our first, like, travel competition year. I flew back from one of the competitions to be with one of my clients because she was having an induction and she was scared and she didn't wanna back up. I mean, we do crazy stuff for our clients that.
That I love to do. I'm happy to
Yes.
do it. If I
It's
don't want to
amazing.
miss
Yeah.
Christmas, I will not take clients in the beginning of January or December. Like you would just block out that time. Christmas, that Thanksgiving to New Year's is one of my busiest times because I rarely block it off. Like I just don't, that's not
Mhm.
when I'm taking vacation or taking time off. Um, and our families, like you plan your entire life and then you see what you need to reschedule.
Yep. I know.
I mean,
Masters of
like,
rescheduling.
I I can reschedule like a boss. And like I was at the hospital yesterday and I had a postpartum visit scheduled for 3:30, and I was like, if the baby's born by 2, I can still stay an hour and 15 minutes and get to the postpartum appointment. So
Mhm.
I'm not going to say a word to this family about, I'm not going to reschedule this postpartum visit until it hits 2:15. And then I'll let them know I need to. And I ended up, she had the baby at 1:31, and I left the hospital at 2:45. Like I got to the appointments, no problem. But like we sit there calculating times in our head constantly to figure out what do we need to move and how much time do I need to give and what it's like a physics equation all the time. And then our families just know
Oh,
we do
sweet.
things differently. Like
Mhm.
I do my sister-in-law does Thanksgiving. We have it set up where we bring this list of things that we buy at the grocery store, like hummus and chips and a veggie platter and a fruit bowl. Like, and that's very intentional because my husband could pick it up at the store and show up for Thanksgiving. And I don't cook anything or have to do anything with advanced prep. You have to set your life up in a very different way. So finances is one thing that, we need to get paid for what we do because it's exhausting. And I've had some dads be like, "Look, we're happy to pay you and I'm glad we have a doula and my wife wants it." Or sometimes it's the husband and the wife's like, we'll hire you because one of us thinks it's important." And then every one of those people postpartum, they were like, "Dude, we would have paid you $1,500 just for the pictures you took. You need to triple your rates."
Right.
I'm like, "You hardly hired me at
Mhm.
$1,500." Like, yes. Like, remember that conversation in the
Like,
beginning where you were like,
after.
but afterwards, when they realize the value of what they're getting, every one of them, there's like, "You need to double your rates." And I'm like, "Yeah, but you wouldn't have hired me if I had done that in the front end. But you can give me a bonus check if you want."
Mhm.
I'm happy to I take tips. You can tip me. Um, but finances are one thing, and then being being in the hospital, being in the OR, our one of our hospitals here allows me in the OR, the other doesn't. And so just being recognized as a valuable part of the care team. Like I think in a hospital situation, if the nurse goes and talks to the OB and they really want to deviate off of this birth plan that this mom, and we're talking mostly like a mom who wants less inductions, right? They want
Mhm.
less interventions. If they see something that's an indication that an induction would be really helpful, and they're all tools, so they can be if you use them in the right time in the right way. Um, being having the nurse say, "Hey Jen, can you come out in the hallway?" Right?
Mhm.
And like she's talked to the OB and she and I have a conversation, or the OB is there. And like we talk and together because I know this woman better than you guys do. This nurse who may be amazing and I love is there for a 12-hour shift. And we could go through 3 or 4 nurse shifts in the time that we're there for
Mhm.
labor. And same with the OB, 24-hour shift. Like you may come and go during this situation, but I remain. And I know this particular family better than you guys ever will. Maybe
Mhm.
you should have that conversation with me included. And we don't often get that ability. So talk to me about how you feel, or the good and the bad and the ugly about being part of the care team in a hospital. With home births, I don't really have an issue. Midwives love having extra hands.
Yeah, I feel like in Seattle, we have a very positive culture around doulas where
Good.
we are very often, almost always recognized as part of the care team. Um, Very rare. I think, like, for me, the biggest struggle is that the care is so I'm in and out of probably 8 different hospitals,
Hmm.
um, 7 of them regularly, one's a little further away. But the care at every single one is extraordinarily different. And so, like, for me, I struggle with, like, why is it okay that things are done this way here and that way here? And then, there's like a lot of negotiation that happens. But I do feel like at most hospitals, the OB will come in or the midwife will come in, the nurse will is usually there. And we can have a conversation of like, hey, we're looking at your contractions and they don't seem strong enough. And we would suggest this. And then they're very respectful usually of saying, like, we're going to step out so you can talk with your doula and
Mm,
then we'll come back and see your decision in 10, 15 minutes. I feel like in general, that's what they do. And like, is like, you guys talk and then let us know what you want to do. Um, Sometimes though it can go like too far the other direction. Um,
Yeah.
like I had a mom where I had stepped out. I think we were talking about this a little bit before. I was recently at an induction where we had very little care from our doctor. Like there were two doctors on shift for 24 hours and one was
Mhm.
sleeping and one was basically in the OR the whole time. And so we were there about 2.5 days, long induction, slow induction, very little progress being made. Weird stuff, it was a medically necessary induction. Weird stuff was happening. Like it was just hard to get the attention that we needed. And then by the time, um, we're like 3 days in, and I had stepped out to go get some food, and I got a text from my client that said, "We need you back ASAP." And I came back, and the nurse was like, stopped me in the hallway and said, "Yeah, did you hear what happened? She has kidney failure. They haven't decided if they want to go back for a surgery or not." And I was like, "Did you not tell them that this is a life-threatening condition? And if she isn't back there in a pretty short amount of time, that this is like could cause like permanent damage." And so sometimes I feel like they almost leave too much of the care to the doulas or all the hard conversations
Mm.
to us. And it's like, well, you're the one that's supposed to be the provider and doing the informed consent. And I'm supposed to be doing the emotional support, not also telling them, like, you need to be doing, like sometimes part of protecting informed consent is offering ideas and making sure that all the options are explored and you really know what all your options are.
Yeah.
Um, but I do believe that that is ultimately the responsibility of the provider. And it is like a pet peeve of mine when they like walk out and then it's me that has to almost make like a medical recommendation, um or be the person to have that hard conversation in a moment where it's like this is really important either way, either that you do something or that you don't do something, or I
I
don't know,
agree.
but
I think
yeah.
doulas have become such a buzzword now. Like we're the answer to the entire maternal health crisis. And although I think we can fill that in a lot of ways, we need to stay in our lane and our role. And
Yes.
so you either have an OB not wanting to include you enough, or the opposite, and like the hospital staff being like, the doula's there so we don't have to do anything. I had the same issue. We went 14 hours with nobody, like hardly, only coming in if I went and asked them to come in for something, like the machines beeping, the whatever, they weren't even coming in on their own for 14 hours, and she didn't get checked for 14 hours. There's got to be a balance in that, because when you do a home birth with a midwife, they don't check as frequently. So I don't think a
Right.
cervical check is the answer. And also, there is a responsibility to make sure things are progressing and there aren't any issues like urine output and kidneys and
Mhm.
stuff that's a really big deal, because birth is unpredictable. So yeah, I think, and holy cow, you had two providers on at the same time, right? Whether it's that situation or it's like the shift changes, you can have
Mhm.
wildly different opinions from one OB or one nurse to the next. So you can switch the shift and have a completely different perspective on what's okay and what's not and how they want this labor to progress.
Mhm.
Wildly different. And I've been at the hospital where, like, look, the shift changes in 2 hours, and so you can ask for a different nurse, or we can just wait 2 hours, and the new shift is going to come on, and that will change the vibe that we have here with it, for better or worse, because like wildly different from one OB to the next. And so there's not even consistency within providers sometimes, for a specific situation, which makes working as a doula really different, because you say standard of care, but if every OB has a different idea of what that means, how are we tracking that as doulas to give the best information to make decisions too?
Yeah. Well, and it's wildly different too. Like if you're at a home birth, you're typically with a midwife that's very skilled, midwife assistant, and maybe student. Like most of the births I'm at typically have like a 3-to-1 care provider to patient. And at the hospital, it's the opposite, where you have many patients to a few providers.
Right.
And there's also like, it's very, very different if you're in labor, your labor started by itself, you're progressing naturally,
Hmm.
versus if you're here for an induction, you're trying to force labor to start, you're trying to get your body to do things it's not ready for.
Yeah.
Like sometimes that is the right path, but it is absolutely the more complex and more difficult path where you need a lot more like reassurances of like, if you have a mom with an epidural with contractions every 3 minutes, but it was started with an induction, do you really know if those contractions are like, strong or weak? If you have a mom with no epidural, you can see like she might be saying, like, oh, I think that was a contraction every 3 minutes versus like, oh my God, that was a contraction, right? Like you can see the intensity from her
Yes.
behavior. And so when you're at the hospital and all that like feedback about how the labor is progressing is masked by your epidural and
Yeah.
you're using all these medications that like, misoprostol might give you a wave of contractions for an hour and everyone thinks you're in active labor and then they
And
disappear
you're
for 12
not.
hours,
I know.
right? And you're not. So it's really important that like the care also shifts to what you as a patient need in the situation, like the cards that you're dealt and
Yes.
environment that you're in, because the standard changes based on where you are.
100%. And I mean, I think as doulas, like I love that birth is unpredictable and we just kind of go with it. And
Yeah.
like, don't rule out anything, but don't rule in anything either. Like, just what do
Mhm.
you want? Because, like we said before, you can give the same information to 10 women and it's the same information, but it's their body, it's their baby, it's their family. And so, what they want or what they're comfortable with, it's the information doesn't change, you the doula doesn't change, but what they want changes considerably from one person to the next. So I think one of my favorite things is like remembering and learning and reminding myself that I'm unbiased in this. It's not my body, it's not my baby, it's not my
Mhm.
family. So there's no judgment. I always tell my clients like there's not good and bad or right and wrong. There's what is working for you, and once we're in the labor and delivery situation, what are the cards you're getting dealt? Because that's going to change this ideal birth plan that you have sometimes considerably. And my goal is no matter what your birth plan is, and assuming it's all healthy baby, healthy mom, right? Everybody's fine in the end, that all the decisions you had to make along the way, you feel great about the outcome. You feel great about the process because what's the worst thing? A home birth to a C-section, right? You have someone who wants a home
Mhm.
birth, has to transport, and then in that transport with the cards that are dealt you end up with a C-section. That's going from your best to your worst case scenario. So if we get there, if we get to your worst case scenario in this situation, do you feel awesome about how we got there and in your decision making along the way so that you feel empowered and wonderful about the birth that you got, even though it was not at all what you started out wanting? And I think a lot of that is us like moving them through the cards that they're dealt.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think one of the things that I have learned as I've been a doula is that when I'm helping a mom with her birth plan, there's a few reasons we do it. One is so that she knows her options because you don't have options if you don't know what your options are. And two, as a doula, I need to understand how a mom makes her decisions so that when she has to make choices, she's getting the information she needs in a way that makes sense and in frameworks where the choices are actionable, right? Where she
Yeah.
can move forwards, whether that is moving forwards with waiting and giving more time and doing nothing, or moving forwards with an intervention, and that she's having support around the emotional process of maybe needing to choose something that she didn't initially want, or around the emotional process of having to set a really strong boundary around her plan that she's not getting the support that she deserves around.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think until parents hire us and go through the process and get to the other side, like we already talked about, you don't know. Even when a birth goes like I couldn't have designed a more picture perfect birth situation, and we have those where I'm like, if I could order a labor and delivery, this
Mhm.
is the one I would order, right? Even when
Mhm.
that happens, still you still have to navigate a lot even in that situation. And I think the word trauma gets used a lot. I think a lot of
Traumatic. I think
I
birth is very
birth is traumatic.
traumatic.
Even if it's smooth, it's
Yeah.
traumatic. And I know, for me in my postpartum conversations at like that day 3 to 4, I'm like, on our next visit, we're going to talk about your birth story. And so I know you probably are processing a ton right now because you're just 3 to 4 days. So in the next week or so, I really want you to consider where you have hiccups in your birth story, because that's when people insert the word trauma, like this part was traumatic. And sometimes the whole thing is so overwhelming, you're not even sure what in that was traumatic. And as you have conversations with your partner or your family, or assist other women who have had babies that you can talk to, you'll start
Mhm.
to narrow down where was the piece in that you felt was traumatic. Because even in that picture perfect, I couldn't order it any better, women still feel these points in that journey that felt a little overwhelming, and then we'll use the word trauma in
Yeah.
that. So I think even the birth that we could order for you, perfect birth that you ideally want, just because you get that doesn't mean like it doesn't necessarily look like you thought it was going to look or feel like you thought it was going to feel.
Yeah.
It's there are points of trauma in that story.
Yeah. Well, and I think we really underestimate as a culture the actual work of giving birth. I mean, even I think the natural birth side of me that loves the birth photography and loves those sweet moments, like sometimes it's really easy to overemphasize, like, oh my goodness, she fell asleep in the tub late in labor. And it's like, well, what is physiologically going on that is allowing her to sleep in something that's so intense? It's like the brain is like, hey, you need like these like crazy hormones going through your body because this is really, really hard. So even if things do go perfectly, or even if you get an epidural exactly when you want to, like the anxiety piece is still there. And then there's
Yeah.
like like you can't take away that part that still has to be worked through. And so I think there's just so many layers to giving birth. And hopefully, as we uncover it and go through it, it leads us to feeling very like strong and accomplished and capable. But I don't think it always does, especially if that framework of like, look what you accomplished isn't um kind of laid out, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I think sometimes as women we're good at doing too much and minimizing what we need and not setting boundaries well. And when you
Mhm.
go through a birth where I really want my women to feel empowered, and I want them to feel smart and informed and advocates. I want them to feel this. In the overwhelm, they don't always. And then there are women who are doing too much and pushing too hard and not asking for help and saying that it's fine. And when you combine that with birth, I mean, that's where a lot of postpartum depression and anxiety and like what there's a lot to work through that you don't know you're gonna have to work through until you arrive there. Like we
Mhm.
can't prep them because we don't know if there's 100 things that could happen in a labor and delivery, and you're gonna get 15, but we don't know which 15 out of that 100, and everybody's different, right? Like, how do you prep
Right.
for that? And then postpartum, which of those things were a little overwhelming or triggering or created trauma within you? And how are you setting boundaries and advocating for yourself and asking for help and not doing too much after going through all that? And I mean,
Mhm.
it's huge. It's huge.
Yeah. Yeah. It is literally the biggest thing we ever go through in life. And I try to like tell my moms like, if you think about any story that you've read, like, if you were a Harry Potter fan or if you read, I don't know, any book, whoever the hero is, the heroine is in a book, they go through a lot in their story. And then
Right.
they eventually come back and make a full circle where they're back home and they reintegrate. but they've come back as like a completely new person and a completely new character, and they're stronger and wiser and have deeper friendships, and they've gained all these things through the challenges they went through. But I think when it comes to birth, we don't always get the gifts that were given through birth because of what you said. So often we're so used to saying no that we will go through the hard, but then we don't receive the gift or the friendship or the support or the closeness with our partners or the ability to trust people and the ability to lean on people more and that more open, connected state that we should, that we're going to need in that postpartum period if
Yeah.
we're really going to thrive. And so I'm glad that you mentioned that because I feel like I hear a lot of my postpartum moms say that like, oh, now that I'm like 6 months out in retrospect, I wish I had asked for more help. Or in
Oh,
retrospect, I
all
wish
of
I would have
them.
said this,
Right?
which is true because we don't know before, right?
Right.
But
Ask for help, setting boundaries, not doing too much, not wishing it away, because the postpartum period initially, like physically, emotionally, hormonally, it's really hard. And I think a lot of women are like, I just need to get through this. And instead of like sitting in it, and it's similar to how husbands feel. I had a husband recently say, so what I want to do is fix it. And what you're telling me I need to do is support her through it. And I was like, yes, that's a great way to say it. You are not fixing this. You are supporting her through it, which means you have to sit in it and kind of just like embrace it and live through it. But I think for women, it's the exact same thing postpartum. Like, we're not fixing this. Don't wish it away. Like, you really have to lean in and sit in it, like embrace the suck, kind of, because it's all so vital. And when you're not doing that, you're doing too much. You're not setting boundaries. You're not asking for help. And
mhm,
that's making it so much more challenging. You need to support yourself through it, not try to fix it or wish it away. And I think it's so human nature to just want to like get through the hard things. You can get to the better thing. And I mean,
yeah,
parenting is the most awesome journey that's also the hardest one you're going to go through. And I think it just becomes different hard and worth it, not the hard is over and worth it. I mean, there's glowing, beautiful moments in how it can be challenging, and it's hard to let someone know that, and for them to just sit through it. So
yeah. And sometimes I
crazy.
hear people like, and I see this in my clients, and I remember feeling this myself. Like in my like darkest moments of postpartum depression, I didn't feel good enough to ask for help.
Mm,
Like I felt like I had to like if I was down here in the base of the crevice, the hole that I was in, but I had to get myself at least like 3/4 of the way up before I could reach up, take a hand, and come the rest of the way out of it. And it really doesn't work that way. Like when we are like drowning in it, we really need to just like, here's my hand, somebody pull me, whether it's a therapist, whether it's a friend, somebody, doula, postpartum doula, because even at that worst moment, that is when we're most deserving and most needing. And hopefully we all have at least somebody, one person in our life that
mhm.
will hear us and be able to like grab our hand on the other side and help us get through it.
I agree. And I have a lot of conversations about like therapy postpartum. I have it in the beginning because it's not an issue for most women, unless you have a history of depression, anxiety, or you've been on medication. And it it's so much more common than we realize, and we don't talk about it enough. And so if I have those conversations in the beginning, then when we get there, bringing that up again at that first postpartum visit and saying, look, it can take a couple months to get into a therapist just to get in to process your birth story and everything
Mhm.
you've gone through. So if you can make those appointments at the end of your pregnancy, you can always cancel it if you don't need it. It doesn't mean you need to go in and get medication. It means you can go in and have one visit and talk about things and realize you don't need it. Like, that would be the best case scenario, right? To set it up.
Right.
But if it takes like 2 to 4 months to get an appointment, and then in the event you need medication, it takes 3 weeks for that medication to start taking effect in your body, we need to be having these conversations much further ahead of what we are doing. So that's some of my prenatal, like, okay, those, you need to be like front load having those conversations instead of emergent. It's preventative versus emergency room. And there's still
Mhm.
going to be emergency room issues that come up, um that, you just don't know are going to happen. But if we can at least have had that conversation before, and then we revisit it at that, I revisited at that first postpartum at 3 or 4 days. Like, let's talk about PMADs. Let's have this conversation. Let's talk about any history of depression or anxiety. Let's talk about in this like overwhelm that you're feeling at 3 or 4 days, when like everything in your body hurts and you're completely overwhelmed and your mature milks come in. Like, we need to have this conversation now in the middle of your overwhelm. Do you need more support? Because sometimes you can come out of that and feel better, and sometimes you don't. But, just being really honest, we don't talk about it enough. So we don't realize that it's a lot more common, and that there's no need to be embarrassed, and there's ways to fix it. You don't have to feel this way. You don't need to feel this. It can be different and better. And you know that more than I do
Right.
personally.
Well, yeah. Well, and sometimes like the responsibilities that come with keeping a tiny human alive, that's the mother side of feeding, or the father. People, most families I work with, those are kind of blended now, where dads are doing a lot of house, the moms are also working and, on
Yeah.
maternity leave. And but like sometimes the sheer weight of what it to keep a human, tiny little human alive is a lot. And it's also
Yeah.
really normal, I think, to have moments of thinking like, look, I love my baby, but I need a break from the responsibility. And how do we as a couple, as a family, help support each other through these moments of of I think overwhelm is the right word, of like,
Yeah.
this feels like too much for me right now. How am I going to cope with that? Or how are we going to cope with that as a couple? And a therapist can be really, really helpful in helping you evolve and change your family structures and bring more cohesiveness into this like very challenging era of new parenthood.
I want to end on like a super happy note. We've talked about lots of different
Yeah.
things. All of it's good. All of it's good. I
Yeah.
mean, all of it's important. But let's talk about like why you became a doula, and if you feel like that original reason is still the reason you keep doing it, or something like that. There's something in that, because I did birth work for 12 years, took a break, and was so ecstatic I could go back to it. The burnout rate is 3 years. We all go into this for certain reasons, right? And then
Mhm.
are those still the reasons that you're doing it?
Yeah. I had a very traumatic, I'm a lost mom first, then very traumatic C-section, then very, very amazing VBAC experience. Um, a big difference between my second and my first birth experience. Um, I don't know how to count the D and C in there. Technically, that was a birth,
I
but
know.
you know, um, anyways, was really the support that I learned so much in that time about recognizing my needs, getting help, accepting help, and what it meant to be in like a very positive relationship. I wanted to be a doula because I wanted to help other moms have that same support through their birth. Knowing that like I needed support in my loss and I didn't have that, and
Yes.
having support through my C-section would have been extraordinarily helpful. And I'm on my 5th year as a doula. There have been so many times I've wanted to quit, because we go through, I mean, you see a lot of trauma. Birth is
Yes.
really, it can be so beautiful, but you can go to like a really beautiful birth one day and then be in the NICU with another family the next day. And then, you're leaving the hospital and you're like right back into another prenatal appointment, right? Like there's not
Yep.
always time to like rest and heal and recover. Um, but I think I'll be doing this forever. I think I have the heart for it, in the sense that like I find that even though it's challenging and it's emotional, that I feel like it's some of the most important work that can be
Mhm.
done. Um, I think the start of motherhood will quite literally define the next several decades of our life. And I feel that every woman deserves support. Um, as I've been a doula, the longer I've been a doula, the more time I spend with people, both on like doing more prenatal so I understand them better, so I can prep them better, so that we are having more positive experiences and less difficult experiences. And then on the back end, I do a lot more postpartum where like now I even go and like food prep or um I do like help with the house and help with the baby and help like let's do a lot some families I do 40 hours. If they'd had a C-section on top of that, then I might do more like 55 hours. And it's really, to me, that has been really helpful in making it I don't leave people at the moment of trauma anymore. I carry out the work a little bit longer, and I think it's healthy for my families in the sense that, like, they're getting more support in those very tender and vulnerable early days, and it's helpful for me as well because I get to see people go through it and come out of the trauma and into, like, typically when I leave a family, a lot of the difficulties have been worked through, and so it's nice to leave people in a really beautiful, like, much very happy place, and that's very rewarding for me.
And I got into it because I had an overwhelmingly positive hospital experience my first time. And that was like sheer luck that I was 21. I didn't know anything. I had my mom and my 18-year-old sister there. And I did get talked into a couple things that I didn't want, but I had a natural vaginal delivery like I wanted. I did not get the epidural. They talked me into it, and then the anesthesiologist is like, she's pushing. She doesn't need an epidural. So he saved me from the epidural. He could have just pushed through and
So
done it.
cool.
So it was
Yeah.
like luck that, but I did get talked into doing things that I didn't want to do. And I didn't really have support. I felt very alone, even though it went well. And I thought, yeah, and then I had 3 home births that were beautiful and amazing, and I had a doula at all of those, and really the one I needed it at the most was probably the first one 'cause, home births are a very different atmosphere, but I
Mhm.
didn't want anyone to feel alone. I believed strongly that you can have a super positive birth experience, even with interventions, even at a hospital, even with all the things, if you have the right education and support, and I wanted to give that, and, like, that's a huge push for me. It's that education and support, and yeah, I mean, I'm so grateful. I am doing it for the reasons that I thought I could do it, and it is making the difference that I was hopeful that it would make. And I think, that's the important part is that we do it, and it doesn't look necessarily like you said. You can go from it's traumatic. We have to be real careful with our emotional space to not take on that secondary trauma of other people's birth experience.
Mhm.
And it's hard work, but we're doing exactly what we wanted to do. We're giving them that support that we didn't
Yeah.
have that we really knew retrospectively we needed. And it's good
Yeah.
stuff.
It's amazing. I cry so many happy tears, and I just like the way that your heart like beams with pride when you have that moment with the family and you get to witness like this entire transformation. It's just so incredible.
So incredible. Thank you so much for coming on again. This was super fun. I left all your information in the show notes and our first podcast episode, the link to that. And so people can find you and talk to you. You're in the Seattle area. I'm in Northern Nevada area if people want to reach out to us. But I'm always happy, I know you are too, to field questions to help people get the support they need, even if they're not in our area. Like we just
Mhm.
know the questions to ask and stuff. So hopefully people will reach out. And Susie, it's just such a pleasure. I can't wait to come. We need a hug in person.
I know. I can't wait to see you in person someday. Thank you so much for having me.